What's up, girls? I just read The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. 1,250 pages. It's very exciting to finish a book that long. It's very satisfying. It's probably the longest novel I've ever read. So that was really cool. And it was great and inspiring. It's a revenge story. It's based loosely on Dumas' father, which is interesting. So Alexander Dumas' grandfather was a general in the French army. He had a child with a black Haitian slave woman, and their son was named Thomas Dumas, which is Alexander Dumas' father. Thomas Dumas was sold into slavery by his father to help clear some debt for a voyage they were going on. And then the grandfather went back and bought Thomas after a certain period of time and brought him to Paris, and he had a title and whatever. So Thomas had like a real respect for hard work as a result of living in slavery for a couple of years in his youth, and he was very courageous and incredibly admirable. Thomas then joined the French army as a standard officer, worked his way up. He became the first, or as a common soldier, he became the first officer, the first black officer in a modern European army in world history, which is crazy. He was huge, over 6 feet tall, which was like very, very big at that point in time, and they called him the Black Devil. He was fearless. He was very outspoken, very honest, and despite like enduring all of the negative symptoms of slavery as a half-black officer or general in the French army, he was still like the guy. And then he was very critical of Napoleon. He thought Napoleon was immoral, power-hungry, and he wasn't afraid to let his opinion be known publicly. And then Thomas Dumas was shipwrecked, thrown in prison, lost his health. Napoleon did nothing to save him. And finally, when he returned to Paris, the government denied him his pension because he had criticized Napoleon, and he died in obscurity at age 44, leaving behind his only son, Alexander Dumas, the author of The Count of Monte Cristo, leaving him with no money, but only this like legend and this lore and his father's reputation. And so Alexander Dumas transcribed that insane story into literature, and that became The Count of Monte Cristo. So The Count of Monte Cristo is fiction, but it's loosely based on his father, and he kind of gives him this like amazing revenge arc that his father was denied by real life, and it must have been like very cool and satisfying for him to be able to do that. Also, like Alexander Dumas was, a quarter black, but he was this like larger than life celebrity within like Parisian society in the 1840s, which is really cool and like shouldn't have really happened. Like he shouldn't have been able to write all these amazing books and be so popular and like beloved given the racial climate of the time, but he somehow persevered and accomplished all these great feats, which is really cool. He was said to be like larger than life, have this big boisterous laugh, would wear a suit and a top hat around with a cane and smoke cigars, and he would throw these extravagant parties at his like house or manor, which he called the Chateau de Monte Cristo, to honor his novel. Really cool. And he would spend all of his money just like emphatically on these parties and friends and whatever, and then he would have to go and write another book, and then he'd spend all the money again. So just a total eccentric, really cool character. The book is incredibly long, partially because the 1840s are an interesting time for literature in Western Europe. If you go back to like 1800, only 15 to 20% of like the Western European populations were literate, could read. And by the time you hit 1840, it's more like 50 or 60%. From 1800 on, the literacy rate gradually goes up. So what started happening was all of these newspapers started to be published, and they were very popular, and there became this need for like lower brow literature, basically, that's not like just Aristotle and Plato or whatever. And so that's really what the Count of Monte Cristo is. It's supposed to be for like everyday working people that are literate. And it was written in this series of installments, published in these newspapers, weekly, monthly, whatever. And he was paid per line or like per segment. So he was incentivized to write as much as possible. And that's why the book is so long, and there's so many subplots, and it's so, this like sprawling kind of magnum opus of plot. So yeah, that's why that's so long. That's why the Three Musketeers are so long. I also find it fascinating that like at this point of literary history, over in Russia, with Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, it's actually like 20 years later or so, but everything is starting to turn towards like moral psychology, and all of these books are starting to look inward and have like, lesser plots. It's more about like the psychology of the character and like really getting to know a specific type of person. And on the other hand, this book comes out, The Count of Monte Cristo, which is just only plot, basically. It's like all gas, no brakes. All the characters are kind of like archetypes. Like he'll create a banker character and then kind of presume that the audience will have stereotypes in mind for what a banker would be like, and he relies on those things. Or like he's assuming that like a man, an honorable man reading one of these installments of the Monte Cristo would imagine like how another honorable man would act in a certain situation. It's like these big general systems or patterns that can be applied to like everyone versus like a specific psychological situation being put onto a character that you've gotten to know really well. The book's really great. It really hooks you. Like the first 300 pages or so is like all just like crazy setup, and you're like, oh, this is gonna be a crazy revenge story. The middle 500 pages or so, you kind of got to trudge along, it lags just a little bit, just how like a lot of long books kind of slow down in the second act. This book is the same way, but it's very satisfying at the end. The last like 350 pages or so, starting at about page 900, all of the loose ends start getting tied up, and you realize like everything you've been reading has been written for a very specific purpose, and it's all going to come back into play. And that's a really satisfying feeling as a reader. I would say to anyone who wants to like write a book themselves, or maybe struggles with plot, this book should literally be studied for plot mechanics. It's like so precise, so smooth. Everything that's introduced for one reason comes back into play for another reason, and comes back into play again for another reason, which is all a good plot really does, is it creates an event that's going to allow you to multitask and change things on different levers at once. So if you're any kind of like novelist, screenwriter, whatever, this is a great book to learn plot mechanics. And yeah, highly recommend Count of Monte Cristo by Dumas.